Thanks, Brian. A couple months ago, Pastor Andy came to me and asked me to preach today, and I said, okay. He said, I wanted to be patriotic. And I started wondering how it is I was going to put together war with a loving God. So I asked our district superintendent, Lori Blaine Gibson, for some guidance, and she just sort of rolled her eyes and said, good luck. So here's my best effort at pulling that off. I have two readings for you this morning. First is from Galatians chapter 5. It says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. And the second reading is from the letter to Hebrews, chapter 13. Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if yourselves were suffering. The word of God through St. Paul. So it's July 4th. What actually happened today? Well, a number of things in history. Yes, we have that Declaration of Independence thing. We'll talk. It actually was approved by the Continental Congress on the 2nd of July, but they wanted to fix some wording, which is how committees work. And the final form of it was approved on the 4th, and that's why the 4th is the day that's celebrated. What else happened on July 4th? Well, in 1817, they started construction on the Erie Canal. That certainly was a boon to commerce in the Northeast. In 1826, weirdly enough, two presidents, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both died on July 4th, within 5 hours of each other. And then 5 years later, also on the 4th of July, James Monroe, the 5th president, died on the 4th as well. In 1884, they held a ceremony in Paris on the 4th of July where the Statue of Liberty was presented formally to the United States. They had already built it. Then they took it apart, shipped it here, and rebuilt it. Kind of weird. 1895, the poem America the Beautiful. See, our song started out as a poem and then was set to music. It was first published in a publication called The Congregationalist. So a lot of things happen on the 4th of July. Many of them tend, in the United States at least, tend to be tied to Independence Day, just rather than random occurrences. From the beginning of recorded human history, both war and faith have figured greatly. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, this is especially well documented because we have the Old Testament. And one of the first blatant references to war in the Bible comes in Judges chapter 6. Verses 11 and 12 say, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior, is what the angel said. The Old Testament is just filled with detailed accounts of wars far back into Jewish history. Much of it is in 1 Samuel, which highlights King Saul's military campaigns, and there's even more in 2 Samuel, that talks about King David and his military campaigns and some other falderah that he partook. In each case, the Israelites attacked other kingdoms that had treated them poorly in the past. Maybe they attacked the Israelites and took their land, sometimes taking them into exile. Sometimes it was just not giving permission to cross their land. That is, they were wars of retribution for past offenses. Now, starting in 1 Samuel, especially chapter 12 of it, and for the remainder of the book, there's all kinds of warfare packed in there. I'll just give you a little taste of it from chapter 15. Samuel, who was a prophet, said to Saul, "I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Almighty Lord says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up out of Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." And, well, as it's gone through history, so it goes. And although the weapons of war that we have now are more lethal, some sense of decency developed over time. This sense of conduct slowly became a matter of international treaty, particularly the First Geneva Convention in 1864 that established the Red Cross and the Red Crescent societies, established their political neutrality, and also addressed treatment of injured combatants on the battlefield. They were entitled to that. It also meant the Red Cross and the Red Crescent societies could visit prisoners and things like that because they were neutral. Now, we've gone a lot farther than that. Successive Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions have finally outlawed the mistreatment of prisoners, wounded, and civilians. Many countries had already started making war a more honorable affair long before any treaties came up. In Europe, it was common for the armies to meet on the battlefield at an appointed hour, and, well, if not settled by the end of the day, they would all go home for the night or back to their camps for the night, and then meet again the next day at the appointed hour to resume. That was nice. Their approach to war was generally governed by a thing called just war theory. Just war theory consists of two main parts. The first one is jus ad bellum, or just cause for declaring war. The second is jus in bello, or just conduct during the war. Now, you can go Google it and read more, or it's going to end up being about a 50-minute lecture that I've given many, many times. This idea of just conduct of war plays well in Christian ideals. The brief version of just war theory tells us that a war should only be, one, to protect one's country or protect a country that is incapable of protecting itself. Two, be waged using force that is commensurate to the threat. Okay, we're not going to send 1,000 people in just for 3 insurrectionists, for an example. Third, it must be realistically winnable. In other words, if you think you're just sending your soldiers off to be slaughtered, that's probably not a good war. And 4, war needs to be the last resort, having exhausted every other way to resolve the conflict. And further, it's never permissible to target civilian populations or to ransack or destroy things that have absolutely nothing to do with the war, like holy places. You've all seen pictures in the aftermath of World War II, and despite the devastation that tended to be concentrated on industrial areas, and unfortunately in a culture where workers live next to their factories. The most commonly surviving buildings are churches and government buildings. So, we can see the conduct of war in the Bible as far back as Proverbs even. It says, "Do not gloat when your enemy falls. When they stumble, do not let your heart rejoice. Or the Lord will see and disapprove, and he will turn his wrath away from the enemy." Now, that was one of the 30 sayings in Proverbs, sayings of the wise, and it suggests that the military mission is the goal. Okay? And no one should gloat over a defeated enemy. After all, they were doing their perceived duty just as much as the victors were doing their perceived duty. And that brings us to our celebration of July 4th, Independence Day, rooted in the American Revolution. So, this is what a revolutionary soldier wore if they were in the militia. One of my revolutionary ancestors was a merchant, innkeeper, justice of the peace, so he was a townsperson. And so I'm wearing townswear. But if the call came to go to battle, they didn't have like a war suit. They took the clothes they were wearing, packed up their rifles and other supplies, and answered the call. So my ancestor actually would have gone to the battle dressed like this, probably also with this coat. Now, how were Christian principles displayed in the Revolution? Well, again, we probably need some backstory, and again, I won't go too deeply into it, or it turns out to be an entire week of lectures. None of us are in the mood for that. First two colonies of England in the New World were Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1608, and Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1620. Jamestown was pretty much loyal to the crown. Okay, they had crown money, they had a lot of perks. Of course, they were after the tobacco and other cotton, variety of things. So in reality, England was pillaging. In 1620, it was entirely different in Plymouth. The Mayflower arrived as an escape from the Church of England. That is, England was a theocracy. It was hard to distinguish the government from the church. Some of the early settlers, the Pilgrims, are called separatists. They believed the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church had turned against biblical teaching by, among other things, extensive church structures and being heavily involved in politics. And so they sought to physically separate themselves from the church. The Pilgrims were followed shortly afterwards. If I keep scratching my head, it's because I was in a cave in Kentucky the other day, and going up a set of steps, my head and a rock found each other. The swelling's down. Anyway, shortly after the Pilgrims came the Puritans, and they were nonconformists. They believed the Church of England needed additional reformation on top of the reforms that had already occurred. But they also brought with them greater British control. And then for about 150 years, the British used the colonists for the gains of England, often disregarding the colonists' welfare and their loyalty to the crown. The British raised taxes on the colonies and restricted where they could sell their products, only in England, at reduced prices, and where they could buy products, only from England, at high prices. The English also led them on military missions against Native Americans who were aligned with the French Canadians and occasionally harassed the French. Anyway, most kids learn about the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Parliament then retaliated by passing the Intolerable Acts, which closed Massachusetts for trade, effectively ended colonial rule. And then, of course, we all know about Paul Revere's Ride, although he wasn't the only one that did it. And the British trading gunfire with the colonial militia at Lexington and Concord, and then at Bunker Hill in 1775. The Americans actually triumphed overall, with the British General Henry Clinton remarking in his diary that a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. You see, what happened was the English decidedly won the last battle at Bunker Hill. Americans won the first two, but the casualty counts were considerably higher, both in number and percentage of troops among the British than among the Americans. The two sides traded diplomatic efforts and skirmishes with each other for the next year, and then on July the 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress approved the contents of the Declaration, pending a few edits, and then finally approved it in the form we know it today on the 4th of July. The Declaration arguably contains the most powerful sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the rest, as they say, is history. In October 1781, the last major battle was won by the Americans and the French over Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. And after that, Parliament refused to further fund the war. That ended it. And now we are on our own. Okay, so that's the history part. But how do we see God, or how do we look in God's eyes for what transpired? Remember, there were a number of criteria for a just war. So let's see how we did for those criteria. The first one was protect one's country or protect a country that cannot defend itself. It seems like an easy one. Okay, did we do good or did we do bad? Should be easy. The only problem is we weren't a country. From the British perspective, it was a civil war. However, it's abundantly clear that the colonies were being substantially harmed by the British, that the Americans could only legally conduct trade with England, and that America was being taxed far in excess of what other British subjects had to pay, and that Americans' rights had been diminished to the point of needing protection from the British military. So I think we're okay on the need to defend. The second point was the war should be waged using force that's commensurate to the threat. That's kind of a tricky one. Okay, England ruled the seas, but only with French assistance could we bring in the necessary supplies, since our trade routes to England seem to have been cut off by having a war with them. Okay, but on land, the colonies could put sizable armies into the field. The limits were how much gunpowder and ammunition they could acquire, and even simple things like clothing and shoes for the army. We all remember very graphic pictures of the winter at Valley Forge, and no shoes, and frostbite was running rampant, and for lack of those kinds of supplies. So the French really were good allies and all that. Was the force commensurate? Probably. We still had more people in our military, though. Third point was the war should be realistically winnable. This one is, as I said, probably a no. We won because we made fewer mistakes than the British. Seasoned British officers in the field figured that out early on, that we were pesky little critters that shouldn't be underestimated. Their field notes from the early conflicts that they sent back to London very clearly said that we should not be underestimated because we were determined. We unleashed guerrilla warfare on them. Yeah, we did it. It wasn't the Viet Cong. We did it. We started shooting from behind trees and rock walls and wherever else we could hide ourselves, rather than fighting in ordered ranks like the British Army was used to. And we showed a passion for our goals, while many of the British Army were simply doing their jobs. Still, to think a ragtag bunch of colonists, even being led by commanders that the English themselves had taught how to fight, could match the might of England was far-fetched. We also said it needed to be the last resort. And I think we're okay here. Big yes. We'd tried diplomacy many times, waged lobbying campaign in London to turn public sentiment and Parliament's decisions in favor of America. We tried bringing in diplomats from other countries to join in the negotiations with the British. We tried civil disobedience like the Boston Tea Party. We're basically out of nonviolent options. And the fifth one, it's never permissible to target civilian populations or to ransack or destroy things that have no role in the war. Well, I'm here to tell you, and any veterans here will know this inherently, on a good day, war is not pretty. In all of our wars, atrocities have occurred, from theft to arson to rape to murder to genocide, and I'm not necessarily talking about our side. After all, we send young people off to war. They're stoked on adrenaline, then they get exhausted, their experiences take a mental toll, and we expect them to behave well all the time? That's unrealistic, no matter which side you're on in the war. But I can say that American warriors from those early days through today have behaved far better than our adversaries. In some cases, atrocities were sponsored by governments, not ours. Think of the concentration camps in Germany. Think about the pillage of China and the treatment of Allied prisoners by the Japanese. Even Union General William Sherman sent a letter to the mayor of Atlanta pleading for the evacuation of all non-combatants before he felt he needed to attack the city due to its manufacturing and transportation support of Confederate troops. The fact that he pleaded for the city to be evacuated before he attacked it is a point often overlooked in history. But just war theory is really, it's a secular thing. That is non-religious, or it has some form in many religions, however you want to look at it. It predates Christianity, but in early Christian times it was adopted through the writings of St. Augustine in the 5th century, and then again by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, to move those ideals into the mainstream of Christian thinking. Now, with additions and modifications due to new technologies, after all, in the 5th century, the whole concept of a powered watercraft or anything manned in the air, whether it's a balloon or a plane or what, would have been a total shock. They never saw it. So from today's view, they had maybe a simplistic approach to the whole thing. But the theory persists today. Consider this part of the United Methodist social principles. Yep, United Methodist Church put this in writing. It's in the section entitled War and Peace. We believe war is incompatible with the teachings and the example of Christ. We therefore reject war as an instrument of national foreign policy. We oppose unilateral or first or preemptive strike actions and strategies on the part of any government. As disciples of Christ, we are called to love our enemies, seek justice, serve as reconcilers of conflict. We insist that the first moral duty of all nations is to work together to resolve by peaceful means every dispute that arises between or among them. We advocate the extension and strengthening of international treaties and institutions that provide a framework within the rule of law for responding to aggression, terrorism, and genocide. We believe that human values must outweigh military claims as governments determine their priorities. That the militarization of society must be challenged and stopped. That the manufacture, sale, and deployment of armaments must be reduced and controlled. And that the production, possession, or use of nuclear weapons be condemned. Consequently, we endorse general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. Our social principles sometimes are a little wishy-washy because they're trying to satisfy everybody. Back to writing by committee. But they seem to reflect just war theory just fine. But how biblical is just war theory? Now, let's leave the Old Testament out of it. I have problems with God directing the Israelites through the prophet Samuel to wage wars of retribution and not even to spare babies and livestock. I have a problem with that. And while the Old Testament describes Jewish history and traditions, we should probably look at God's new covenant with his people. And that's described in the New Testament. Its mood is much more one of restraint from violence and abundance of love. Today's scripture readings emphasize Paul's view on love, and that freedom needs to be exercised through God and not subverted to sinful things. Now, they're not asking us to not consume. They're not asking us to not have sex. They are not asking, it is all about excess. Remember Christ's statement, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's? Paul expanded on that in his letter to the Romans. Chapter 13, he said, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. As Paul says, obey the authorities, but live as a pacifist if you can. If it all, and do it all through love. And that is what this day, the 4th of July, means. Our ancestors of 240 or so years ago fought to bring fairness and peace to our fledgling country. And the bold experiment has worked out pretty well so far. We have stayed out of wars and less threatened. We have limited destruction of the enemy. We even started post-war rebuilding of countries that we defeated. And it was all built on the shoulders of soldiers who fought in the revolution and those that aided them. Those would be continental soldiers or militiamen. My hat is off this day to them and to all veterans, active duty personnel, reservists, National Guard members who pledged, trained, and fought with dignity. That should make us all proud to be Americans. Amen.